The early morning sun spilled over the city skyline, casting a warm glow on the sprawling park that was already bustling with participants, volunteers, and onlookers. The annual charity marathon was one of the city's most celebrated events, a day when people from all walks of life came together to support causes close to their hearts. Banners flapped in the gentle breeze. Booths handed out water bottles and snacks. And excitement buzzed through the crowd like electricity. In the midst of the crowd, our protagonist, Marcus, stood tall and poised. His athletic build and charismatic smile drew curious glances. Yet no one seemed to recognize him. A world-renowned track athlete, Marcus had been a symbol of strength and resilience for years. His name was familiar to millions. But here, today, he was just another runner, ready to join this cause. Dressed in his running gear, he scanned the crowd with a mixture of excitement and calm. He'd come to enjoy the race, to connect with the people, and to give back to the community. As he approached the entrance gate, Marcus noticed a group of uniformed officers stationed nearby. Most participants breezed through the checkpoint, offering quick smiles or nods to the officers as they went. But as he approached, he noticed one officer's gaze linger on him, scrutinizing him with an intensity that felt unnerving. "Hold it right there," one of the officers called out as Marcus approached. The tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as though Marcus had already committed some unseen offense. Taken aback, Marcus paused, meeting the officer's gaze directly. "Yes, officer," Marcus replied, keeping his voice polite, though a hint of tension crept into his posture. The officer, a tall, middle-aged man with a hard jaw and cold eyes, sized him up. "This is a charity event," he said pointedly, his gaze dropping to the charity logo on Marcus's shirt as if it didn't belong. "Are you here to participate?" "Yes," Marcus replied, maintaining his calm. "I registered a few weeks ago. Here's my pass." He reached into his pocket to retrieve his registration pass. But the officer held up a hand, stopping him. "I'll ask the questions," the officer snapped, eyes narrowing. "What's your business here?" "Really?" For a moment, Marcus felt the world narrow around him, a sinking feeling in his stomach. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated this way. He knew too well the sting of suspicion without cause, of being seen as a problem rather than a person. He took a steadying breath, keeping his voice level. "Like I said, I'm here to run." A second officer stepped forward, a woman in her 40s with a sharp gaze that flicked between Marcus and her colleague. She gave a slight smirk, shaking her head. "You know, we get a lot of folks thinking they can just walk in and join the crowd. But it's a charity run, not just some free-for-all." Marcus clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. He held out his registration pass, his name clearly visible, along with his bib number. The officer glanced at it briefly, then back at him, an unspoken message in his eyes: "You don't belong here." The first officer sneered. "Never heard of you," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Maybe you should head back the way you came before there's any trouble." The words were laced with an unmistakable threat. Marcus's pulse quickened, and he fought the urge to argue, to defend himself against their baseless assumptions. He had spent his life breaking barriers, proving his worth time and again on the track. He was known around the world for his achievements, his discipline, his unshakable drive. Yet here, to these officers, he was nothing more than a suspicious figure, someone who didn't belong. A crowd had begun to gather, watching the tense exchange. Some looked away uncomfortably, others whispered among themselves, but no one stepped forward. Marcus felt a rush of emotions: anger, frustration, but above all, a profound weariness. How many times had he been judged for the color of his skin rather than the strength of his character? With a final look at the officers, he took a slow, deliberate step back, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scene. He turned and walked away. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't over. He would run this race. He would prove them wrong. Not for their sake, but for himself and for everyone who had ever faced the same injustice. As he walked back to a quieter part of the park, he clenched his fists, feeling the fire within him ignite. This race had become more than just a charity event. It was a battle against prejudice, against every stereotype and assumption that had been thrown at him throughout his life. He was determined to show everyone what he was made of, and to show those officers that their ignorance and hatred had no place here. The race would go on, and he would be part of it. Whether they liked it or not, the city's annual charity marathon had always been a highly anticipated event, drawing participants and spectators from all over. The atmosphere was electric. Music played from loudspeakers. Volunteers handed out race kits, and friends reunited with laughter and hugs. Street vendors lined the pathways, selling fresh juice, protein bars, and handmade trinkets. Banners and flags flapped proudly in the cool morning breeze, displaying the charity's logo and the race's theme: Run for Unity. Marcus stood just beyond the main entrance, taking in the scene with a quiet, satisfied smile. Tall, with a commanding presence and an easy confidence, he looked every bit the professional athlete. However, today he wanted to blend in, to simply enjoy the thrill of the race and the community it brought together. His fame wasn't on his mind. Instead, he relished the chance to contribute to something meaningful. He wasn't here as Marcus Wade, Olympic gold medalist, just Marcus, a man running for a cause. As he adjusted his bib number and approached the gate, Marcus noticed a group of uniformed officers monitoring the entry points. Many people passed through quickly, barely exchanging words with the officers. But as he drew closer, a slight change in their posture caught his attention. One of the officers, a tall man with a sharp jawline and an almost cold expression, straightened and stepped directly into his path. "Excuse me, sir. Need you to hold up a moment," the officer said, his voice loud enough to turn heads nearby. Marcus paused, taken aback by the sudden interruption. "Yes, officer," Marcus replied, keeping his tone polite, though he could already feel a knot forming in his stomach. He'd dealt with this kind of situation before. But here? At a charity run? The officer's gaze lingered on him, moving slowly from his face down to his shoes, a hint of skepticism in his eyes. "Can I ask what you're doing here today?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, a touch of surprise in his expression. "I'm here for the race," he said simply, holding up his registration pass. The officer didn't even glance at the pass. Instead, he gave a small, derisive chuckle. "A lot of people come to spectate. Hang around. 'Cause trouble." He paused, glancing sideways at his partner, a woman with a tight-lipped smile and narrowed eyes. "You don't look like you're here to just run a race." Something about the way he said it, the emphasis on "you don't look like," sent a wave of irritation through Marcus. He took a steadying breath, reminding himself to keep calm. "Actually, I've been training for this," he said, still holding out his pass. "I registered weeks ago. Here's my confirmation." The officer's partner stepped forward, a dismissive smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She looked him up and down, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "You know, we get a lot of folks thinking they can just walk in and join the crowd. But it's a charity run. Not some free-for-all, she said, crossing her arms. Marcus clenched his jaw, feeling his patience fray. He was a professional, a trained athlete. He had nothing to prove to these people. And yet, here he was, being treated like he didn't belong. He pushed his pass forward, his voice firm but restrained. I have my registration, just like everyone else here. The officer finally snatched the pass from his hand, glancing over it briefly before looking back at Marcus with an unimpressed stare. Never heard of you, he muttered, handing the pass back carelessly. Marcus felt the weight of humiliation settle over him. A heavy, familiar feeling that stung more than he'd like to admit. He knew that in their eyes. He was just another black man, an outsider. A stranger. Someone who didn't fit the image they expected to see at an event like this. For a moment, he wanted to snap. To call them out. To make them understand exactly who he was and the struggles he had overcome to stand here today. But he held back, drawing on the discipline he'd honed over years of training. Over a lifetime of breaking barriers. Without another word, he turned and stepped back, ignoring the officers' smirks and the whispers from the crowd that had gathered. As he walked toward a quieter section of the park, he could feel the frustration and anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. He took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling his lungs, grounding him. This was supposed to be a simple day. A moment to give back. To enjoy the sense of unity the race promised. But now it was something more, a reminder of the battle he'd been fighting his whole life. He clenched his fists, feeling the fire ignite within him. He wasn't just running for a cause anymore, he was running to prove, once again, that he deserved to be there. That his worth wasn't defined by their prejudices. He found a bench a short distance away and sat down, closing his eyes to center himself. As memories flooded back of times he'd been underestimated, dismissed, or outright insulted, he felt his resolve solidify. He remembered the times his mother told him to run through the walls they put up. Son. She had been his first coach, his toughest critic, and his biggest cheerleader. Her voice echoed in his mind, calming and steady, urging him to rise above, to keep pushing, to never let them break his spirit. Marcus opened his eyes, the look of determination hardening in his gaze. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He would return to that starting line, run this race, and show everyone, especially those officers, that he belonged here just as much as anyone else. As Marcus sat on the park bench, he could feel his pulse gradually slowing, his breathing returning to a steady rhythm. Around him, the cheerful chaos of the marathon preparations carried on, blissfully ignorant of the tension that had just transpired. Families laughed together. Groups of friends took selfies. And children wove through the crowd, waving little flags handed out by the volunteers. The world seemed vibrant and carefree. And yet, for Marcus, a shadow lingered. He watched the racers lining up near the starting point, the energy drawing him in. This was where he belonged, in the heart of the action. Among the thrumming excitement and camaraderie of a sport that had shaped him into the man he was. Run for Unity, the slogan emblazoned on banners all around him, felt painfully ironic in that moment. Unity, he thought, was only offered to those who were seen as fitting, as acceptable. But his mother's voice rang clear in his mind, steady and fierce, grounding him once more. He remembered her guiding him through countless struggles, pushing him to channel his pain and frustration into something powerful. Her words replayed, clear as if she were beside him. If they don't see you for who you are, show them. Show them exactly what you're made of. He stood up, feeling a surge of energy flow through him. There was no way he would let the officer's ignorant assumptions stop him. He had endured far too much. Overcome far too many barriers to be held back by a handful of small-minded men. His eyes moved back to the starting line. A fierce determination lighting his gaze. Today, he would run, not just for unity, but for dignity. For respect. For everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Just as he took a step forward, another runner passed by, giving him a quick nod and a friendly smile. It was a small gesture, but it reminded Marcus of the reason he'd come here in the first place. He was here for the cause. For the community. For the people who had come to run. To cheer. To support. He was here for something bigger than himself. As he approached the starting area, he kept a low profile. Finding a spot in the crowd, the officers who had confronted him earlier were stationed near the gates, casting occasional glances at the runners. But they seemed too occupied to notice him now. He blended in, letting the excitement of the other runners energize him. The rhythmic shuffling of feet, the low hum of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. All around him, people were preparing, stretching, adjusting their bib numbers, tightening their shoelaces. The air grew thick with anticipation as the announcer took the stage, his voice booming over the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this year's charity marathon. Thank you all for coming out today to support such an incredible cause. Together, we're running for unity. For change. For a brighter tomorrow. The crowd erupted into cheers. The sound like a wave crashing around him. Marcus felt the familiar buzz of adrenaline kick in. His muscles primed. His mind sharp and focused. This was what he lived for. This moment before the race began. Where every breath, every heartbeat was dedicated to the pursuit of a goal. To pushing his limits and giving everything he had. He remembered his first race as a child. He had been a shy, scrawny kid, unsure of his place in the world, until his mother signed him up for a local track meet. He remembered the thrill of that first race. The feeling of his legs moving beneath him. Faster and faster. The wind rushing past his face. The cheers of the crowd. It was that race that had set him on this path. That had shown him the strength he carried within himself. And today, he would channel that same energy. That same resolve. To prove that he belonged here. The starting gun fired. Snapping him back to the present. In an instant, the runners surged forward. A wave of motion and energy sweeping over the starting line. Marcus fell into stride. His feet hitting the ground with a familiar rhythm. His mind and body synchronizing in perfect harmony. As he picked up speed, the world around him blurred. The faces in the crowd melting into a single mass of color and sound. He could feel the curious gazes of some spectators. Their eyes lingering on him as he moved ahead with a grace and speed that set him apart. He knew they were watching. Perhaps wondering who this man was. Where he had come from. He could sense the officer's eyes on him too. But now, instead of shrinking under their scrutiny, he used it as fuel. Letting their doubts and prejudices drive him forward. With each step, he felt the weight of years of training. Of discipline. Of battles fought and won. The taunts. The slurs. The dismissive glances. The subtle, and sometimes blatant, acts of discrimination he'd endured all his life, they were all right there with him. Pushing him to go faster. To go harder. Every insult. Every slight. Every dismissal had led him to this moment. To this race. Where he would show them all exactly who he was. As he broke away from the pack. His pace increasing. The crowd began to notice. Whispers turned to cheers. And his name began to ripple through the spectators as some recognized him. Is that Marcus Wade? The Olympian? He heard it. But he kept his focus. His mind honed on the finish line ahead. He wasn't running for fame or glory today, he was running for something much deeper. He was running for his right to exist in spaces that had been denied to him. For the countless others who had faced the same barriers. Who had been told, time and again, that they weren't good enough. That they didn't belong. And as he ran, his strides smooth and powerful, the tension and anger melted away, replaced by a quiet, fierce joy. This was his element. His sanctuary. The place where he could be fully himself. Unburdened by the prejudices of others. He let himself get lost in the rhythm. In the feel of his body moving. Strong and free. Cutting through the air with every step. The finish line came into view. And he pushed himself even harder. Feeling the exhilaration build as the cheers grew louder. The crowd now fully aware of who he was. Of the victory he was claiming, not just over the race, but over every barrier that had been placed in his path. As he crossed the finish line, arms raised in triumph, he felt a wave of emotions wash over him: pride, relief, and a deep sense of accomplishment. He had done it. He had run this race on his own terms. Despite the doubts, the discrimination, the attempts to keep him out. He caught his breath, looking around at the faces in the crowd. Some smiling, some still in awe, but all of them watching him. He had shown them, shown those officers, shown himself, that he belonged here, that he would not be stopped by anyone's expectations or biases. This was his victory, his message to the world. And as he stood there, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face, he knew this was only the beginning. There were still battles to be fought, walls to be broken down. But today, he had taken a powerful step forward. And he wouldn't stop until he had paved the way for those who came after him. The officers watched from a distance, their expressions unreadable. But Marcus didn't need their approval. He had won this race on his own terms. For himself and for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And that, he knew, was a victory worth far more than any medal the day after the race. Marcus's name was on every news outlet and social media feed. Clips of his triumphant finish flooded the internet, showing him pushing through to claim victory. His effortless, graceful speed and resilience against adversity had caught the attention of viewers across the nation. Yet, the story that gripped people the most was not just about his win, but the humiliation he had endured at the hands of the officers. Captured by an amateur videographer standing nearby. The clip was raw and powerful, showing Marcus's calm yet pained expression as he faced the officers' disrespectful treatment. It quickly went viral, sparking outrage, sympathy, and a rallying cry for justice and equality. People were moved by his quiet dignity in the face of blatant discrimination. Comments poured in: he showed them by winning. This is exactly why we need change. Marcus's simple act of running had transformed into something far greater, igniting a fierce debate and drawing public attention to the prejudices that still lingered beneath the surface. In the days following the race, Marcus was invited to speak about his experience on numerous talk shows and interviews. Reporters and activists wanted his thoughts. But Marcus was hesitant. He had always been private, preferring to let his actions speak louder than his words. But he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was an opportunity to address the larger issue. To speak for those who hadn't been able to speak for themselves. Finally, he agreed to one televised interview, hoping to set the record straight and share his perspective. Sitting across from the interviewer, a respected journalist with a reputation for tough questions, Marcus kept his composure. The lights were bright, the cameras rolling, but he was calm. his voice steady and deliberate as he recounted the events. It wasn't just about what happened at the race, he said. Meeting the interviewer's gaze directly. It was a reminder that no matter what we achieve, no matter how hard we work, some people will still look at us and see nothing but their own biases. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But we're more than that. We are resilient. And we will continue to rise above. I ran that race because I refused to be denied my place. And I'll keep running until those walls come down. The interview sent ripples through the public consciousness. And soon after, more people who had experienced similar encounters came forward. Stories of racial profiling, of unfair treatment, of dreams hindered by discrimination began to flood the internet. Marcus's story had given others the courage to share their own. And a movement was building. Yet, amid the solidarity and support, Marcus knew there was still one more thing he had to do: hold those officers accountable. He made his way to a local law office, determined to press charges for racial discrimination. A team of civil rights attorneys agreed to take his case pro bono. Recognizing its significance, his lawyers explained the challenges, the obstacles he might face. But Marcus was undeterred. This wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had been wronged, who had faced barriers they shouldn't have had to overcome. The case made headlines, the public eagerly awaiting the trial. But as the court date approached, the officer's defense attorneys attempted to discredit Marcus. They dug up old interviews, tried to twist his words, even question his intentions at the charity event. Marcus knew they were trying to undermine him, to paint him as a troublemaker, a man looking for attention. Yet, through it all, he kept his composure. He'd been in the public eye for years. He understood how people tried to spin narratives to their advantage. With every accusation, every insinuation, he reminded himself of his purpose, of the greater impact this case would have. And as the trial began, he walked into the courtroom with the same quiet determination that had carried him across the finish line. The courtroom was filled to capacity. Reporters and supporters alike packing the seats. All eyes fixed on him as he took the stand. The defense tried to rattle him with pointed questions. But Marcus held his ground. He spoke clearly, recounting the events with honesty, his voice unwavering. When asked why he'd chosen to pursue legal action, he looked the defense attorney squarely in the eyes. "Because this isn't just about me," he said firmly. "This is about change. This is about making sure that no one else has to face what I did. That no one else has to be told they don't belong because of their skin color or their background. I'm here because I have a responsibility to stand up. Not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been silenced." The prosecution presented evidence, the viral video clip, witness testimonies from those who had seen the exchange, and a series of statements from people who had experienced similar treatment from the same officers. The courtroom was silent, each testimony building a case too powerful to ignore. The tension was palpable. The weight of years of pain, discrimination, and resilience felt in every word. The defense attempted to downplay the situation, arguing that the officers had merely been doing their job, that they had no reason to believe Marcus was a legitimate participant. But each time they tried to justify their actions, the video footage, the witnesses, and Marcus's unwavering testimony countered their arguments. The court proceedings stretched on for days. The public's attention riveted as the case exposed the deep-seated biases within the system. On the final day, Marcus gave a closing statement. He looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of people from all walks of life, young, old, black, white, and everything in between. His voice was calm but powerful as he addressed the court. "We talk about justice, about unity, about creating a world where everyone is equal," he said. his gaze steady. But that world doesn't exist unless we're willing to face the truth. Unless we're willing to hold people accountable for their actions. This isn't just my fight, this is a fight for all of us. We're all here. In this courtroom. Because we know that things have to change. His words echoed in the room, leaving a lasting impact on everyone present. The judge looked thoughtful. The jury members' expressions somber. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came down. The officers were found guilty of racial discrimination, sentenced to disciplinary action and mandatory sensitivity training, with a requirement to publicly apologize. Marcus's case had set a precedent. A small but meaningful step toward holding those in power accountable for their biases. As he left the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and reporters, Marcus felt a sense of closure. He knew this victory was just one step in a much larger journey. But it was a step that mattered. His victory on the track had been for him. But this victory, here in the courtroom, was for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Walking through the crowd, he saw a young boy staring up at him with wide, admiring eyes. Marcus knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze. "Remember," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his journey. "Don't let anyone tell you where you can or can't be. You belong wherever you decide to go." As he straightened and continued through the crowd, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had not only proven himself but had paved the way for others to stand up and demand their place. And in that moment, Marcus knew that his journey wasn't over, it was only just beginning. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Marcus felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. His case had stirred emotions across the country, attracting supporters and skeptics alike. The charity race had turned him into an icon, a symbol of resilience in the fight against discrimination. His story was retold in newspapers, broadcast on television, and shared across social media. Yet, amid the groundswell of support, he knew that his battle was far from over. His lawyers, a team of dedicated civil rights advocates, prepared him meticulously, walking him through each detail of the case. They warned him of the defense's likely strategy, to paint him as a troublemaker, someone who was stirring up conflict for personal gain. They would dig into his past, question his motives, twist his actions to fit their narrative. Marcus had heard it all before. He had been in the public eye long enough to know that people would project their biases onto him. But this time, it felt different. This time, it wasn't just about his personal reputation, it was about the thousands of people he represented. Those who had faced similar injustices but never had a platform to fight back. Each night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, reflecting on what lay ahead. He knew the trial would not be easy. As memories of the incident replayed in his mind, he felt the anger and frustration resurface. But he also felt something else, resolve. He thought about the young athletes who looked up to him, the fans who had sent him messages of encouragement, and the strangers who had shared their own stories of racial profiling. This fight was for them as much as it was for himself. The trial began in a packed courtroom, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters crowded the gallery, their pens poised, ready to capture every word, every reaction. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression calm but focused, his presence commanding. He glanced at the defense table, where the officers sat, their faces expressionless, avoiding his gaze. He knew they had been trained to appear unflappable, to present themselves as dutiful public servants merely doing their jobs. But Marcus saw through the facade. He remembered the look in their eyes that day, the way they had dismissed him without a second thought, the sneers that told him he was unwelcome. The prosecution opened by laying out the facts of the case, presenting the viral video as evidence. The grainy footage played on the courtroom screen, showing Marcus's interaction with the officers, capturing their cold, condescending tones. Their refusal to even look at his registration pass. The courtroom was silent as the video played. The tension palpable. When it ended, the prosecution turned to the jury. Their expressions grave. "This case isn't just about Marcus Wade," the lead attorney said. Her voice steady and clear. "It's about every person who has ever been judged not by their character, but by the color of their skin. It's about challenging the biases that too often go unchecked, that too often lead to unfair treatment and injustice. We are here today to hold these officers accountable, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong." The defense's strategy was as brutal as Marcus had anticipated. They questioned his motives, suggesting he was seeking fame and financial gain. They brought up past interviews, twisting his words to make him seem ungrateful, arrogant, and entitled. They even hinted that he had exaggerated the interaction for attention, trying to sway the jury with subtle, insidious doubts. When Marcus took the stand, the defense attorney wasted no time. He fired off questions with an aggressive edge, aiming to shake Marcus, to break his composure. "Mr. Wade," the attorney began, a smirk barely concealed. "You're a professional athlete, used to the spotlight. Wouldn't you agree that this entire situation has only increased your visibility? Brought you more attention than any race you've won?" Marcus met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not here for attention," he replied calmly. "I'm here because no one deserves to be treated the way I was. This isn't about my career, it's about respect and dignity." The attorney pressed on, trying to paint him as hypersensitive, suggesting that he had misunderstood the officer's intentions, that he had overreacted. But Marcus held his ground. His responses measured, each word chosen with care. "When you've spent your whole life being judged, questioned, and dismissed because of your skin color," he said, his voice firm yet filled with emotion, "you don't misunderstand these situations. You see them for exactly what they are." Throughout the trial, supporters filled the gallery, some holding small signs of solidarity, others simply present to bear witness. His fans, young athletes, community leaders, and everyday people came to support him, standing behind him in silent unity. Their presence gave Marcus strength, a reminder that this fight was about more than a single incident. It was about challenging a system, about pushing back against a society that too often allowed prejudice to go unchecked. As the trial progressed, the prosecution called on witnesses who had been present at the race. Several bystanders testified to the officer's demeanor, describing the sneers, the dismissive attitudes, the unwillingness to even listen. Each testimony built a picture of the scene, a painful reminder of the prejudice Marcus had faced. Some in the audience wiped tears from their eyes as they listened, moved by the accounts of an injustice that felt all too familiar. The most impactful testimony came from an unexpected source, a young woman who had been standing near the entrance that day. She had recorded the video that went viral, capturing the officer's treatment of Marcus. On the stand, she recounted her shock at the way they had treated him, her voice shaking as she described her realization that this was no isolated incident. "I didn't know who he was," she said, glancing at Marcus. "But I could see how they looked at him, how they spoke to him. It was wrong. And I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." The defense tried to discredit her, questioning her intentions and posting the video. But she remained steadfast, her testimony clear and unwavering. As she stepped down from the stand, she looked at Marcus, a silent message of support passing between them. The final day of the trial arrived, and Marcus took a deep breath as he prepared to give his closing statement. He stood before the courtroom, looking directly at the jury, his voice steady but filled with conviction. Every day, people face discrimination, prejudice, and judgment, not because of who they are, but because of how they look. I've been blessed with a platform, with achievements that have allowed me to stand here today. But this case isn't just about me, it's about challenging the way we see each other, the way we treat each other. It's about demanding respect, demanding accountability, and demanding a better future for everyone. I ran that race not just to win, but to prove that I belong there. And I stand here today, fighting for the same reason. The room was silent. Every face turned toward him, captivated by the passion in his words. He returned to his seat, feeling a sense of closure, a feeling that he had given everything he had. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The officers were found guilty of racial discrimination. Their sentence included disciplinary action, sensitivity training, and a formal apology to Marcus. The court erupted in applause, supporters embracing, tears streaming down some faces. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. A weight lifted from his shoulders. As he left the courthouse, surrounded by friends, fans, and strangers who had come to support him, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had won not just the case, but a victory for respect, for equality, for dignity. He knew the fight wasn't over, that there were still battles to be fought. But this victory was a step forward, a step toward a world where no one would have to face the injustices he had endured. In the crowd, he spotted a familiar face, the young woman who had recorded the video. She smiled at him, a look of admiration in her eyes. Marcus approached her, extending a hand. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with gratitude. She shook his hand, her voice soft but resolute. "No thank you. You stood up for all of us." As Marcus walked away, the cheers of the crowd fading behind him, he felt a quiet pride settle within him. He had not only run the race of his life, but he had paved the way for others to run their own races, to fight their own battles, and to rise above the barriers set before them. And in that moment, he knew that his journey was only just beginning. The days following Marcus's court victory were both a whirlwind and a period of deep reflection. He was celebrated as a symbol of resilience, hailed as a hero for standing up against injustice. His image appeared in newspapers, on television, and across social media platforms. Messages of congratulations and admiration flooded his inbox, with people from all over sharing how his story had inspired them to confront their own battles. Yet, amid all the praise and the public attention, Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions, a quiet pride, certainly, but also a lingering heaviness. That night, alone in his apartment, he found himself replaying the trial in his mind, thinking about everything he had endured to get to this point. He had won a victory, but it was only one case, one moment in a long and complicated fight. The reality of discrimination was woven deeply into the fabric of society. And his win, while important, was just a small step toward change. Still, he reminded himself, even a small step forward was a step worth taking. One evening, Marcus received an email from the young woman who had testified in his defense. Her message was brief but heartfelt, expressing her gratitude for his courage and sharing her own experiences of prejudice and marginalization. Her words lingered in his mind long after he closed his laptop. She hadn't needed to send him anything, yet she had reached out, offering her own story as a reminder of what his fight meant to others. Her words reignited his resolve, reminding him that his battle had never been only about his own dignity, it was about fighting for a more just world. Over the next few weeks, Marcus met with advocacy groups, student organizations, and community leaders who wanted to make use of the momentum his case had created. Many invited him to speak at events, to join panels, to add his voice to their causes. Although public speaking had never been his comfort zone, he began to accept invitations, realizing that he now had a platform from which he could amplify the voices of others. At each event, he encountered people who had faced similar discrimination, people who looked to him as a symbol of hope. One particular event stayed with him, a panel discussion at a local university. The room was packed with students and faculty, eager to hear from Marcus and the other panelists, who were all activists in their own right. As he took his seat, he noticed a young man in the audience, his posture tense, his gaze fixed on the floor. There was a subtle nervousness to him, as if he was bracing himself against the world. During the Q&A session, the young man finally raised his hand, his voice shaky but determined. How do you find the strength to keep going?" he asked. "When the world keeps telling you that you don't belong, how do you keep fighting?" For a moment, Marcus felt the weight of his own journey settle over him, the memories of every slight, every insult, every door that had been closed to him. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "It's hard," he began, meeting the young man's gaze. "There are days when it feels like the whole world is against you, when you wonder if it's worth it to keep pushing. But I realized something: we don't just fight for ourselves. We fight for the people who come after us, for the ones who might not have the strength or the voice yet. And every time we stand up, every time we refuse to back down, we make it a little easier for them." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The young man nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. Marcus felt a surge of emotion. This, he realized, was the true purpose of his fight. It was about more than winning a court case or proving a point. It was about empowering others to believe in their own worth, to see themselves as deserving of respect, of dignity, of belonging. As the event concluded, several people approached Marcus, thanking him, sharing their own stories. Each conversation reminded him that his journey wasn't solitary. It was woven into the lives of countless others who faced their own battles each day. In the weeks that followed, Marcus felt a new sense of purpose. He began volunteering with organizations dedicated to dismantling racial biases and educating communities on diversity and inclusion. He worked with youth programs, visiting schools to speak with students about the importance of resilience, courage, and self-respect. He shared not just his victories, but also his struggles, the moments when he'd felt defeated, the times when he had doubted his own worth. He wanted them to see that strength wasn't about never feeling afraid or uncertain. It was about pushing forward despite those feelings. Gradually, he began to see the impact of his efforts. At one school visit, a young girl approached him afterward, her face alight with determination. One day, she told him, "I'm going to stand up to people who treat others badly, just like you did." Her words struck a chord deep within him, reminding him that each small interaction, each shared story, had the power to inspire change. Yet, as much as he focused on his advocacy work, Marcus knew he wasn't immune to the realities of prejudice. There were still moments when he felt the sting of bias, the subtle looks, the hesitant tones, the questions that hinted at unspoken assumptions. But now, he carried himself differently. He had a newfound strength, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own struggles. Every time he faced discrimination, he reminded himself of the people he had inspired, of the young man and the girl who looked up to him. His fight was no longer just about his own place in the world. It was about opening doors for others, about paving the way for a generation that would, hopefully, face fewer barriers than he had. Months after the trial, He received a letter from one of the officers who had wronged him. It was unexpected. A formal, carefully worded apology, acknowledging the harm caused and expressing a willingness to learn and change. The words were measured, cautious, perhaps influenced by the disciplinary actions imposed on them. But Marcus recognized a sincerity behind them. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight. But this letter felt like a small, significant step. He responded with a brief note of his own, accepting the apology, choosing to let go of the anger he'd carried, though he would never forget the pain it had caused. In time, Marcus's life began to settle into a new rhythm. He continued his advocacy work, returned to his training with renewed vigor, and even rekindled connections with old friends who had followed his journey from afar. He had transformed his pain into purpose, using his experiences to build a legacy that went beyond his athletic achievements. One day, as he jogged through the park where the charity race had taken place, he noticed a familiar young face. It was the same boy he'd seen after the trial. The boy who had looked up at him with admiration in his eyes. The boy was running alongside his friends, his laughter echoing through the park as they raced one another, their strides carefree and full of joy. Marcus watched, a smile playing on his lips, feeling a deep sense of peace. He knew he couldn't change the world overnight, but he had planted seeds of hope, courage, and resilience, and in that moment, he knew that was enough. As he continued his jog, his footsteps light and steady, he felt a sense of fulfillment, a quiet assurance that his fight had made a difference. He no longer ran just for himself, he ran for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had been made to feel less than. And as he moved forward, mile after mile, he carried with him the strength of his journey, knowing that each step brought him, and those who followed, closer to a world where everyone could run free. Months passed since Marcus's victory in court, but the impact of his case lingered in the public's consciousness. The trial had sparked not only a widespread conversation about racial profiling but had also laid the foundation for real change within the city's police department. His victory became a turning point, inspiring local government officials to reassess training practices and implement programs to tackle implicit bias among law enforcement officers. Marcus watched these developments with cautious optimism, realizing that his case had catalyzed a ripple effect, a step toward a world he had always hoped to see. Yet, Marcus knew that change would be neither quick nor easy. For each small victory, there was resistance. In his inbox, alongside messages of gratitude and support, he received notes from people who viewed his actions as a threat to the status quo. Some accused him of exaggerating his experience, others of causing trouble for good officers just doing their jobs. But each message of doubt only fueled his resolve to continue his work. One afternoon, he was invited to a town hall meeting organized by a coalition of civil rights groups. They were discussing new policies aimed at addressing systemic discrimination, and they wanted him to share his story. As he took the stage, he saw faces of all ages and backgrounds watching him, hopeful and expectant. They wanted to know that change was possible, that their own struggles mattered and could make a difference. Marcus spoke with an earnestness that silenced the room. When I crossed that finish line at the charity race, he began, I thought it would be the end of my story. I thought I could put that painful experience behind me. But I realized that this journey, this fight for respect and equality, isn't something that ends with one victory. It's a road that stretches far ahead. And we have to walk it together if we want to see real change. The crowd erupted in applause. But Marcus noticed one face in particular that caught his attention, a young black woman in her 20s. Looking both hopeful and nervous. After the event, she approached him, hesitating for a moment before speaking. Thank you, Marcus, she said softly, her voice trembling. I've faced situations like yours. I work as a teacher. And I know what it's like to be seen as less than. To have people make assumptions about you. But seeing you fight back, it gave me the strength to speak up about what I face at my job. It's still hard. But I feel like I have a voice now. Marcus nodded. Deeply moved. Her words reminded him of why he'd taken on this fight, not for fame. Not for validation. But to empower others to find their own voices. To stand tall despite the weight of prejudice. In the days following the town hall, Marcus became involved with community projects focused on reform. He collaborated with local activists to create programs that addressed bias within schools, workplaces, and community organizations. His advocacy led him to meet leaders who were tirelessly fighting against discrimination and for equality. He learned from their experiences, gaining insights into the systemic changes needed to build a more inclusive society. One evening, Marcus received a surprising call from the city's police chief, who invited him to speak with officers about his experience. The invitation was a remarkable gesture, especially given the resistance he had initially faced from the department. After a moment's hesitation, he accepted, recognizing it as an opportunity to address the very people who had once treated him unfairly. The day he arrived at the police station, Marcus felt the familiar tension return. As he walked through the hallways, he noticed the skeptical stares of some officers. Their body language tense. Their expressions guarded. But he held his head high, meeting their gazes with a quiet determination. He was here not to confront but to engage. To plant the seeds of change, however small they might be. In the room, he spoke openly about the impact of discrimination. How it feels to be seen as a threat based on nothing but one's skin color. He described the humiliation, the pain, the exhaustion of constantly fighting for respect. Some officers listened attentively. Others appeared indifferent. And a few even seemed openly resentful. But as he continued, he saw a few heads nodding, a few faces softening. And he knew that he was reaching at least some of them. "I'm not here to tell you how to do your job," he concluded, his tone calm but impassioned. "I'm here to remind you that the people you protect and serve are just that, people. We're all human. And we all deserve respect. If you see us for who we are, not just for what you assume, then we can build a safer, stronger community." As he left the station, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment. He knew that not everyone would change overnight. But he had planted a seed of empathy, of understanding. And that was a start. In the following months, Marcus continued his advocacy work, speaking at events, meeting with community leaders, and pushing for reforms that would help eliminate bias in law enforcement and other sectors. He worked with the police department to develop a training program focused on empathy, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. Slowly, he began to see a shift, not just in policies, but in attitudes. One afternoon, as Marcus was preparing for another community meeting, he received a call from one of the officers who had been part of his initial confrontation at the charity race. The man's voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "I just wanted to say," the officer began, "that I was wrong. I didn't realize the impact of what I did. How I treated you. I've been through the new training program. And it's changed the way I see things. I'm sorry. Marcus. I really am." Marcus listened, feeling a sense of closure that he hadn't known he needed. He thanked the officer, acknowledging his apology. And after the call ended, he felt a deep sense of peace. This was what he had been fighting for, not revenge, not punishment, but understanding, growth, and the possibility of a more just world. In time, Marcus's efforts led to the formation of a coalition, a group dedicated to promoting racial equality and justice within the community. He worked alongside educators, law enforcement officials, and activists, focusing on long-term initiatives that would help dismantle prejudice and build bridges between diverse groups. The coalition grew rapidly, attracting people who believed in his vision of a society where everyone, regardless of background, was treated with respect. At the coalition's first annual event, Marcus took the stage once more. Looking out at the sea of faces, faces of all colors, all ages, all walks of life. In that moment, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. His journey, which had begun with a painful confrontation, had blossomed into something far greater than he could have imagined. As he spoke, he reminded the crowd of the importance of unity, of seeing one another beyond surface-level judgments, of working together to create a world free of bias. The audience listened with rapt attention, inspired by his words. And when he finished, they rose in a standing ovation. After the event, as people gathered to celebrate, Marcus felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see the young man from the university panel, the one who had asked how to find strength in the face of adversity. The young man smiled, his eyes bright with determination. "Thank you, Marcus," he said. "You've shown me that change is possible. I'm going to keep fighting too." Marcus nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. This, he realized, was the true legacy he wanted to leave, not just victories in court or changes in policy, but a generation inspired to believe in justice, in equality, in the power of standing up for what was right. As the evening drew to a close, Marcus stood quietly, watching the celebration around him. He felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment, knowing that his journey had transformed him and, in turn, had helped transform others. He had come a long way from that charity race, but he understood that the finish line was not an end, it was a beginning. A doorway into a future where each step brought them all closer to a world united in respect and dignity. And as he looked out at the people he had inspired, he knew that, together, they would continue the race for justice, each stride paving the way for a better tomorrow. The coalition's first annual event concluded, but Marcus lingered at the venue, watching as attendees shared stories, exchanged ideas, and connected over a shared vision for change. People shook hands, hugged, and spoke animatedly, filling the space with a palpable sense of hope and possibility. Marcus felt an immense gratitude for the journey that had brought him here, for the trials that had challenged him, and for the people who had stood beside him. Yet, even as he felt pride in how far they had come, Marcus knew that the road ahead was long. The battle against prejudice and injustice wasn't a sprint but a marathon, a continuous journey requiring patience, resilience, and a deep commitment to growth. He was only one person, but he saw himself now as part of something far greater, a movement fueled by voices and hearts united in purpose. That night, after returning home, Marcus sat alone in his quiet apartment, reflecting on everything that had led him to this moment. He thought of his mother, the woman who had raised him with unwavering strength and instilled in him a belief in justice and equality. Her words echoed in his mind, run through the walls they put up. Son. She had prepared him, unknowingly, for a life defined by resilience, by courage, by the constant pursuit of a better world. A tear traced down his cheek as he thought of her, feeling the presence of her spirit guiding him still. In the following months, Marcus continued working tirelessly with the coalition. They organized workshops in schools, hosted community events, and created spaces where people could discuss difficult topics without fear of judgment. The coalition's initiatives began to extend beyond the city, inspiring neighboring communities to form similar groups. sparking a broader movement of grassroots activism. Slowly, Marcus witnessed attitudes shift, small changes at first. But each one felt like a ripple building towards something bigger. One day, Marcus received an invitation to speak at a national conference on civil rights and social justice. The conference would be attended by influential leaders, politicians, educators, and activists from across the country. Marcus hesitated, feeling the weight of the responsibility. This was a far bigger stage than he was accustomed to, and he wondered if he could do justice to the voices he represented. But as he looked back on his journey, on the people who had stood beside him and the countless lives his story had touched, he knew he had to accept. When the day arrived, Marcus took the stage in front of thousands, his heart pounding but his resolve steady. As he looked out over the vast audience, he felt a surge of gratitude for every obstacle he had faced, every painful experience that had shaped him into the man he was. He began his speech by sharing his story, the charity race, the trial, the journey from anger to purpose. But he didn't stop there. He spoke of the countless individuals he had met along the way, people who had endured similar struggles, who had found hope in his story and had begun to believe in their own power to make a difference. "This fight isn't just mine," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "It belongs to everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. Everyone who has ever felt dismissed, marginalized, or invisible. We are all part of this movement for justice, for dignity, for equality. And we will not stop until every person is treated with the respect they deserve." He paused, looking out over the crowd, his heart swelling as he saw people nodding, some wiping away tears. He continued, his voice softer but just as powerful, speaking from the depths of his soul. "Our world will not change overnight. It will take years, perhaps generations, to dismantle the biases that have been built into our society. But every step we take, every voice we lift, brings us closer to that future. We are planting seeds. Seeds of empathy, understanding, and respect. And though we may not live to see the full harvest, we will know that we helped to nurture it." As he finished, the audience rose to their feet, a standing ovation that lasted long minutes. Marcus felt a rush of emotions: pride, humility, gratitude. He had come to the stage alone, but he felt surrounded by the countless individuals whose stories had intertwined with his own, each one a testament to the resilience and courage that could drive real change. After the conference, Marcus found himself approached by people from all backgrounds: young students, seasoned activists, community leaders. They thanked him, shared their own experiences, and expressed their commitment to continue the work he had begun. He knew now, more than ever, that he was not alone. This movement was alive, sustained by the passion of people from all walks of life, all working toward the same vision. One evening, Marcus visited the same park where the charity race had taken place. He walked along the familiar path, the memories of that day vivid in his mind: the confrontation with the officers, the humiliation he had felt, and the quiet strength that had propelled him to finish the race. As he neared the starting line, he saw a small group of children playing a game of tag, their laughter filling the air, their innocence a reminder of the world he was fighting to create. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, noticed Marcus and approached him shyly. "Are you the guy from the race?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with awe. Marcus smiled, nodding. "I am," he said gently. The boy grinned, a spark of excitement in his eyes. "One day, I'm going to run in a race like you did. And I'll run as fast as I can. Just like you." Marcus knelt down, looking the boy in the eye. "That's good," he said softly. "But remember, it's not just about running fast. It's about running with purpose. When you run, think about what you believe in, about who you want to help, and let that guide you." The boy nodded, as if absorbing every word. And with a quick wave, he rejoined his friends. Marcus watched them run off, their laughter and energy filling the park. A beautiful contrast to the struggle that had once taken place there. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the seeds he had planted would continue to grow, nurtured by a generation that believed in justice, in equality, in the power of unity. As he stood there, the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the park. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. And in that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. His journey had been filled with pain, with challenges, with moments of doubt. But each step, each trial, had led him to this point, where he could look back and see the countless lives he had touched, the barriers he had helped to break, the world he had helped to change. He had started his journey fighting for his own dignity, his own respect. But in the end, his fight had become something far greater, a fight for everyone who believed in a better world. A world where every individual could run their race with pride, without fear, without prejudice. And as he left the park that day, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with purpose. A legacy that would live on in the hearts of those he had inspired. The race, he realized, was never truly over. It continued in the lives of those who would carry forward his vision, who would keep running, keep striving, keep believing in a world united by respect and compassion. And with each step he took, Marcus felt a profound peace, knowing that he had not